Hello, students of American history. Coach Keith here, fearless leader. I'm going to run you through a PowerPoint that will hopefully help you answer some of the questions on your Westward expansion assignment, especially that cause effect graphic organizer at the bottom, as well as maybe talk about some things that you will find interesting about the old Wild West. So, first and foremost, a little explanation of what part of the country are we really even talking about when we talk about westward expansion. This beautiful green blob here, oftentimes called the Great American Desert or the Great Plains, is the area that we're looking at. Notice you've got the Rocky Mountains to the west. Um, Here is Kansas City right here. So when we talk about the Great Plains, we're basically looking at the part of the United States that's directly west of where we're at right now. So in the 1860s, the federal government, which is the national government, did several things to encourage Americans to move west. One was the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave people 160 acres of free land if they farmed that land for 5 years, which is an incredibly good deal. To put that in perspective, if you lived in rural Platte County today, 1 acre of farmland, we're not talking about an acre of land in town, we're talking about an acre of farmland, like trees, fields, all of that stuff, is going to cost you about 10 grand an acre. So just looking at the value of 160 acres of land right now, you're looking at like $1.6 million for 160 acres of land for free. So that's a pretty good deal. And a lot of people who lived on the East Coast took advantage of this. They moved out west, farmed the land, even if they really didn't have much farming background. This act was one of the biggest motivating factors for Americans to move west in the 1860s. Okay. Really important for you to remember that one. One of the other things that encouraged people to go west was the government paid for and helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. So by 1869, when it was completed, you could literally get on a train and go all the way from Sacramento, California, clear across the country to New York City. And so this was a big deal, and the government paid for it, paid for the two companies listed there to build it. And the railroad itself was largely built by Chinese immigrants, which becomes important because one of the first groups you're going to see in America that is discriminated against by having their immigration rights limited is the Chinese, because once the Chinese immigrants are finished with the Transcontinental Railroad, the American government says, thank you for your hard work, but we don't want you around, which was very controversial at the time. And we'll talk a lot more about that decision in further chapters. There's a picture of the completion of the railroad. One company started in Sacramento and built east. One company started in Omaha and built west. And there is a picture of the two trains coming together. Don't know how they got them turned around and going the other direction. There were three primary industries in the West, and we are going to run through each one rather quickly: farming, mining, and cattle ranching or grazing. So we'll start with farming. Farming on the Great Plains, as you can see, a beautiful sod house there in the picture. Mostly immigrant families. Again, these were families who lived in the eastern part of the United States who typically had very little money before they went out west to farm. Because if you would have lived in the East and you would have had money and land, jobs, things of that nature, then you probably wouldn't have gone west to the unknown. So there were a lot of poorer immigrant families who went west to farm. Once they got there, even though they were promised this great opportunity, they encountered extremely cold winters, extremely hot summers, very little water sources, and massive dust storms that would appear out on the Great Plains, especially in the summer when it was dry. And what they ultimately had to do was depend on one another for survival. They may have gone out west thinking that, oh yeah, we're lone wolf survivor style. We're going to go do this on our own. But they realized very quickly that they needed one another to survive. And this idea of cooperation amongst people on the frontier was a really important part of the West. Farming as an industry, these Bonanza Farms, as they were called, were massive farms where farmers would choose one or two, maybe, crops to grow for profit. So instead of just growing food that your family would eat to survive, which is called subsistence farming, these farmers would grow one or two crops to make a lot of money. And they would sell them, of course. And by the late 1800s, these huge bonanza farms were the dominant form of agriculture. The last point, overproduction and the dependency on railroads were problems. We're actually going to talk about that in a later chapter. But essentially what was happening was they weren't cooperating well. So if a bunch of farmers in the same area were growing the same crop, let's say they're all growing corn, there's only so much corn that people want to buy. And so they were overproducing. Whenever you have more corn or any crop than what people want to buy, the price of that corn is going to go down. So farmers were losing money. They were also becoming way too dependent on the railroads, and the railroads would charge farmers really, really high shipping costs during certain times of the year when they knew they were going to be shipping a lot of crops. And so there were lots of problems that farmers faced out on the frontier in the late 1800s. Some of these farmers were women and some were minorities. There was a book written by a lady named Willa Cather that describes a lot of the difficulties that women faced on the Great Plains. We'll talk more about that when we talk about women's rights later in the class. But because women played such an important role on the Great Plains, the first state that actually gave women the right to vote in 1869, that's 50 years before women were given the right to vote nationwide, was Wyoming, oddly enough. Another group of people that you can kind of see in this picture here, if I move my face, the Exodusters. The Exodusters were Southern African Americans who left the South after the Civil War, having gained their freedom. They left the South and went west to take advantage of the Homestead Act. And the name Exodusters actually comes from a book of the Bible called Exodus, where Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land in Israel. And so these Exodusters gave themselves this nickname, taking on this almost spiritual journey out of former slavery and bondage in the South out to the West, where this land of opportunity awaited them. The second industry that we're going to look at, mining and lumbering. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but one of the things that I always like to point out is, people think about going out west to strike it rich, whether it was in the gold rush or the silver rush or whatever. Most of the people who made money out west weren't the folks who were actually finding gold and silver. It was the people who were providing supplies for the miners. So like the folks who made the jeans that they wore, the folks who made the pickaxes that they used to dig, the folks who owned the restaurants on the way out, those were the folks who made a lot of money from mining, and not so much the individual miners. One of the significant silver deposits, the Comstock Lode, kind of became this iconic mining town in Nevada, Missouri. Nevada's the state. Another important government law from the federal government, from the national government, that helped encourage westward expansion was the Timber and Stone Act, which offered really, really cheap land to settlers where there was like dense forest or timber. And so the settlers, of course, would then have to chop down the trees But the land was very, very cheap, and so that encouraged more people to go out west. So not a ton of information on mining and lumbering that's really super important that you need to know. There's one of the outcomes of the Timber and Stone Act. Ranchers, cattlemen, we'll talk more about those when we do our DBQ in class, but the long drive was very important during this era in American history. During the Civil War, when farmers had to abandon their farms in Texas to go fight elsewhere during the Civil War, cattle, just the population of cattle grew tremendously. And so once the Civil War was over, there were so many cattle that these ranchers decided that the best way to capitalize on the number of cattle in Texas was to pay cowboys to herd the cattle or drive the cattle literally hundreds of miles north to railroads where they could be slaughtered in these railroad towns and put on trains and shipped all across the United States. So the long drive became this iconic part of American history for quite a while until a couple of things happened. One, barbed wire was invented. So farmers got frustrated by these cowboys driving, thousands and thousands of cattle across their crops. I mean, the cows would eat the crops, they would trample them. And so barbed wire was placed around fields, which made the long drive really difficult. And another thing, more railroads were built, which allowed for farmers to put their cattle on trains in Texas and ship them north. But this is whenever you talk about the Great Plains and westward expansion, this mythological view of the cowboy is a pretty important part of American history, but it's a very short-lived part of American history. By the 1880s, the traditional cowboy, as you may know it, really ceased to exist. The last topic that I want to look at for this chapter is Native Americans. And really quickly, we're going to talk more about Native American people and their history as we go through the course, but just as kind of to set the stage, if you will, during the Civil War, Great Plains tribes, most notably the Sioux, which you've probably heard of the Sioux Indians before. Most notably, the Sioux were paid I shouldn't say they were paid, they were promised large sums of money to move from different locations on the Great Plains. Most of the promises that the government made to the Sioux Indians were just phony. They never actually paid up. And so you see several instances where Native Americans, in their frustration, attacked settlers. And then you also see multiple instances where the U.S. military slaughters Native Americans who are either unsuspecting or, like in the case of the Sand Creek Massacre, many of the warriors from the tribe were out on a hunt, and the military showed up and just slaughtered a bunch of women and children because the men were off hunting. As horrific and sad and tragic as the Sand Creek Massacre was, there are many instances of things just like that occurring. The reason why I use the Sand Creek Massacre is because it's one of the more famous instances where that happened. But the U.S. military, as well as people who weren't even in the U.S. military but were acting on their own accord, caused so many acts of violence toward Native Americans during this era that it's one of the saddest and most tragic parts of American history, because whenever you look at the history of Native Americans as a whole, many have not recovered. Many tribes have not recovered from what was done to them during this era. Um, so the government stance on Native Americans was that basically they hoped that Native Americans would become more like white people. And so they began encouraging Native Americans to send their kids to boarding schools. They encouraged them to adopt Christianity as a religion. They encouraged them to get rid of their Native American cultures. And whenever they attended these boarding schools, the name of the game was Americanization. In other words, we're going to do everything we can in these boarding schools to make Native American children adopt white ways. And I put some examples, like they would only be allowed to speak English in the boarding schools. They had to cut their hair. They couldn't go by traditional Native American names. And in fact, in a Supreme Court decision, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock in 1903, Congress was given the authority from the court to make whatever Indian policies it wanted, and Indians were only citizens with permission from the government. In other words, Native Americans in the United States were second-class citizens who couldn't defend themselves in courts, and the government could make whatever laws they felt like were beneficial or necessary to Native Americans. Probably the biggest piece of legislation or law that the government passed was called the Dawes Severalty Act, or the Dawes Act. Basically, what the Dawes Act did was it dissolved Native American tribes. In other words, these tribes that have been living together on reservations or wherever for the last, hundreds, if not thousands of years in some cases, those tribes were dissolved, and the heads of every family would receive 160 acres of land, which sounds like a great deal, similar to the Homestead Act. The problem was most of that land was given in Oklahoma, where the farming is very poor. And again, a lot of these Native Americans knew one way of life. They knew and were familiar with one area where they had grown up, where their family had lived for generations. So to remove them from that area, give them 160 acres of land to farm, many of which the Native Americans weren't even farmers. It was really, really tough on Native Americans. And it's one of those things that on paper, it seems decent. Like, hey, we're going to give you 160 acres of land. That sounds good in theory, but whenever it's one, not very good land, and two, you don't really know how to use the land. Three, you're being removed from land that your family may have lived on for generations. That's pretty rough. And so you see a ton of Native Americans having to give up a lot of their original tribal lands. This way on the slide, it says most native land was lost, 66% of their land between 1880 and 1930. So slowly the government is removing Native Americans from the Great Plains. The end of armed resistance, probably the most famous example of the Native Americans resisting the U.S. government was the Sioux Indians, led by Sitting Bull. And the Sioux refused to go to leave their traditional homeland, and so the U.S. military took action. However, in one of the most, probably the most famous example of Native Americans resisting the U.S. military was whenever General George Custer was defeated and killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. One of the very few victories for Native Americans against the U.S. military during this era. Some strategies for survival. Whoops. Many of the Native American tribes just gave in and started following white customs. In other words, they said, you know what, this isn't worth it. We're watching women and children being beaten to death. We're watching many of our loved ones go fight and die. Let's stop this and let's just give in. Let's adopt white customs. They started to participate in an event called the Ghost Dance, which was kind of a religious, spiritual dance where they would pray for and dance for the return of the buffalo and the elimination of the whites. But a lot of the military were afraid of Native Americans participating in the ghost dance, and so ultimately the government ordered that it had to stop. The last example of armed Native American resistance that was really substantial was in 1890 at the Battle of Wounded Knee, which is sometimes referred to as the Massacre at Wounded Knee, because not only were many Native Americans killed, but again, in what became routine for the U.S. military in the late 1800s, many women and children were killed as well. And so that really marks the end of armed resistance for Native Americans. I believe I covered everything on the cause and effect chart. I know that got a little bit long, but please feel free, obviously, to pause or fast forward or whatever as you go through the video. And I hope you're still awake.